Podcast. I'm here with my friend Paul Kingsnorth, and this time last year I was out at his place there in Ireland, and about a year and a half ago he came out to the Wagon Box for the first the Machine and Human Nature conference. And Paul, welcome to the Wagon Box Podcast. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Always good to see you. It'd be nice to see you in the actual Wagon Box soon as well. That's always a much better experience.
You're coming down in July. He's going to be attending the third uh, Doomer Optimus Machine and Human Nature event. I think we're calling it the Doomer Optimus Campout, and it's
Hmm.
basically it's going to be like Woodstock for what? For something like I
For
wanted to
whatever
think
you
about
call
that,
yourself.
talk about that, because I feel like
Yeah.
you and I and a lot of the people that attend these events kind of think of themselves a little bit as outside of the mainstream paradigms. And I remember actually before I ever met you, um, one of the things that sort of connected us is that our friend James Pogue quoted me in the Vanity Fair like 2 years ago, saying, "Well, for us, it's not as much left right; it's more us against the machine." And I think that's what unites a lot of these people who are going to be descending on the Wagon Box in late June. Um, a sense that there's this tension between us, the people, and the machine, and you are have a book coming out in October about the machine. You've popularized this term. Obviously, not the only person that's used it, but I want to explore this idea. What is the machine? What differentiates it from machines? It's not obviously just a matter of. I'll give you my idea, and then I'd like to hear your. My idea is not just a matter of machines, technology, computers, whatever, but it's an amalgamation of a mindset of modernity and sort of hyper-rationalism or materialism or something like that with the modern gadgetry. And I think the most important part in my mind is this sort of the machine of power, the corporate and political machine, the sort of global groupthink. But anyway, that's my idea. Tell us what do you mean when you talk about the machine fighting the machine,
Yeah,
existing in the shadow of the machine?
well, I think you've just described it for me, really. So I don't probably need to say anything else. I think we're done.
Shucks.
It's a pretty good
No, can't do
description.
it.
It's okay. Sorry, it's going to be a very short podcast otherwise. Um, so here's the thing. I think this phrase, the machine, as you said, I suppose by writing about it quite a lot over the last few years, and I have got this book called Against the Machine coming out, which does what it says on the tin, coming out in September. Um, so I've popularized this term, but it's not my term. It's a term I picked up from a lot of poets and novelists and writers who've been really probably using it since the Industrial Revolution in different ways. And we've all seen it
Mm.
in popular culture. We've seen it in the Matrix, and we've seen it in the Terminator films, and we've seen it in Aldous Huxley, and we've
Sure.
uh, some of my favourite poets, from R.S. Thomas to D.H. Lawrence, have all popularized the term. And it is pretty much, I suppose, as you describe it. So it's not a question just of technology. Technology has always existed. Technologies emerge from the mindset of the machine, but I see the machine more as a mindset, more as a way of thinking and a way of seeing, which, as you say, I think really has emerged in the modern period. But it didn't just exist then. In this book I've written, I've drawn on the work of a lot of greater writers than myself who wrote about this previously, and one of the best known would be Lewis Mumford. Lewis Mumford
Mm.
did a vast two-volume book called The Myth of the Machine,
Really?
and Mumford talks about this thing he calls um, well, no. Let's take a step back. Mumford says that if you look at the machine as a mindset, as a way of living, a way of creating a culture, the first time it really emerges is the Egyptian pyramid age. So what you have then is this vast culture, which is what he calls a machine made of human parts. So in order to make these enormous, incredibly sophisticated monuments just for the pharaohs, you need to create an incredibly organized, focused, um, technological, mathematical culture, which uses slaves, basically, because there's no fossil fuels then. We have fossil fuels now, we don't need slaves anymore. We just use them instead. It's modern slavery. But the top-down organization of a system which can use people as human parts and which thinks mechanically and has a certain way of seeing, seems to emerge at certain periods in history. And it always does emerge in a society which is very top down, which is very focused on power at the top, always emerges when there's a huge project to be done. At one point, Mumford in his book compares the building of the pyramids to the building of the space rockets today. And he says in
Hmm.
both cases, you have an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology being created by an incredibly organized machine-like society in order to take a favored few up to the heavens, which I quite like.
Hmm.
So what you've got is a way of seeing, and this
Okay.
way of seeing particularly becomes very concentrated in the modern period because we have the Industrial Revolution, we have the discovery of fossil fuels, we have a kind of individualism, we have a desacralization of the world, so we no longer believe there's a God that we are somehow beneath and we have to serve or follow. We believe that humans are at the center of things. We start to see the world as a machine. We see it as a mechanism. We see nature as something that we can dominate and manipulate and recreate. And we move into the age we're in now. So what you have is a kind of combination of very, very top-down societies, very powerful
Hmm.
states, very powerful corporations, always in alliance with each other. And as you say at the beginning, it doesn't make any difference whether the governments are allegedly left or allegedly right. They'll all end up with this top-down
Hmm.
dominating culture, organized in slightly different ways. You have fossil fuels, which make it incredibly cheap and easy to dominate the natural world and to give us things we never had before. As a
Sure.
basis of that, you have a onrush of science and technology. You also have this rationalist, scientistic, human-centered mindset. There's no God anymore. There's nothing sacred. You combine all of these things, and you get a culture which, according to Ian McGilchrist, who's another one of the writers I talked about in the book, he thinks this culture is unique in human history. He thinks it's an
Hmm.
entirely rationalistic, mechanistic, mathematical culture that's entirely focused on the left hemisphere of the brain,
Hmm.
which sees the world in a different way. And I think
Spreadsheet
that's the
brain,
key.
some people call it.
It
Yeah.
is. It is spreadsheet brain everywhere. And when we look at, say, the anxieties we have over things like smartphones and what they do to our brains, what they do to our children's brains, that's just a manifestation, one small technology, as part of this
Yeah.
bigger mindset.
I,
You could only create something like a smartphone or a computer if you already had the mindset that saw the world in a particular way. If you see what I mean, and
yeah, I
that's what I
guess I
think we
wonder,
call the
thinking,
machine.
listening to you, if it's a couple things come to mind. One, you know, obviously you're not against any hierarchy or hierarchical organization. You might be skeptical of them, but I mean, you're a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is a hierarchical organization. It's a global organization. And I mean, you look at anything that humans have ever done of any scale, and maybe there's a case to be made that all of them are bad, but they all require some organization, some top-down structure. Is it you're not against organization as such, are you?
Well, organization isn't a problem. Hierarchy is inevitable. People have to organize themselves into things. Humans have always used technologies. Here we are on the internet, but long before that, you could argue, and plenty of people have, that language is a technology.
Sure.
Obviously, the minute that we invent fire, we have a technology. Without using tools, at the very least, humans go extinct in about 5 minutes because everything else is bigger and has sharper teeth than us, right? So there's no escape from that.
Yeah.
What seems to have happened, for whatever reasons, and I wonder how much the discovery of fossil fuels has to do with turbocharging
Hmm.
the whole thing, but we have got a culture which has enabled us to think in a particular way. So if I don't know, if you look at different cultures and the way they developed around the world, some of them were very static for a very, very long time indeed. And they lived in
Sure.
a fairly harmonious balance with nature and with each other. And that doesn't make them perfect. It doesn't mean they're wonderful. It doesn't
A
mean that
lot
we
of
have to
them died
romanticize
horrible
them.
deaths.
Yeah, well, they do that as well. But then so do plenty of us. There's plenty of horrible deaths going on here. Um, so the point is, there's a different way of seeing,
Yeah.
and we have a way of seeing which has enabled us to treat the world like a mechanism, and has enabled us to treat each other like a mechanism. And it's not so much a matter of power, which always exists, or hierarchies, which always exist, as the scale of them, because
Okay.
everything's so concentrated now. I mean,
Sure.
what power do you have really to influence the American government? Or what power do I have to? Nothing really. In reality, maybe
Well,
your local government. You're smiling. Come on, tell me.
I mean, I
Not much so.
guess I think there is, and maybe this is pernicious, maybe not, but I think there remains this American idea. People mention Americans as embarrassed future millionaires. Every American from the bottom up all thinks of themselves as temporarily, accidentally poor, but it's all coming together soon. And I think many of us really do feel like um we can influence things. I don't think that much, but I mean, I don't know. Yesterday I was, in a room with Steve Bannon and some of these guys. I could, probably get a word in edgewise, and I feel like some of our people, our friends, have been able to have some influence over things. But yeah, these huge machines are operating, and even the people that are ostensibly in charge, Trump and all these guys, they're really just sort of riding along with these huge waves that may be largely out of their control. But I guess I'm wondering, is it a matter of balance? Is it like the spreadsheet brain is an important part of human living? It's just taken over. Is it an imbalance, or is the whole thing just need to be chucked because it's not an imbalance? It's poison to the root.
Well, again, if I suppose if you go back to Ian McGilchrist, who's the man who's written about this most, although other people have as well, he has this lovely image of the master and his emissary when he's talking about the two ways of seeing that the different parts of the brain conjure up. So he talks about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, which are supposed to work in concert with each other. The right hemisphere being the part that tends to see the whole, that tends to have a kind of empathic, whole picture way of seeing things, and the left hemisphere as being the part that can break things down and analyze them. Both of those things are necessary, right? We need all those things in our lives. If we have too much left
Sure.
brain, all we can do is break things down and analyze them, see the world like a machine. If we have too much right brain, we're poets who don't know how to feed ourselves. So we need a bit of both. We need a balance here. So the whole point, I think, I find it pretty convincing, is just that we're a culture that's hugely out of balance. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, and he says that one of his most striking claims is that if you look at a lot of modern art from the West over the last 100 years, it looks like the kind of art produced by people who are literally mentally ill. And I think the possibility that we are a culture which is actually mentally ill is pretty
Hmm.
convincing to me. So what do you do about that? Well, you have to cure yourself. So this way of seeing is a useful way of seeing if it's in service to something bigger. That's the way I see it now. If it's
Hmm.
not in service to something bigger, it just becomes tyrannical. So
It's
everybody
good.
needs the part of themselves that knows how to rationalize and knows how to organize and knows how to set up systems. We need to do these things, otherwise we all die. But
Sure.
if that becomes an end in itself and we can't see beyond it, if we can't see the bigger picture, if we're unable to even think outside the boundaries of science and technology and mathematics, then we're in big trouble. And I think we've
So
got
it
to that point. So
comes back to a
it's a question of
spiritual
rebalancing.
renewal.
It's a question. It comes back to how you could rebalance yourself, how we could rebalance a culture that was back in balance with nature as much as we ever can be, back in balance with our right brain. As you say, it's a spiritual question for me.
Hmm.
And the actual technologies and the economic systems that exist, much as I have plenty of complaints about them, are a manifestation of that way of seeing, but they're also a
Hmm.
manifestation of power. To go back to that question of whether you
Sure.
can influence the government, because the average Joe cannot influence the government, which is
No.
why America exists in the way that it does, right? It's why you have a system of checks and balances. It's why you had a revolution. The whole point of America, it seems to me, is to be able to say, can we set up a system of power where we can actually control it and influence
Influence it.
it,
Yeah.
and it can be accountable to the people rather than being accountable to tyrannies?
Yeah. That's been gone
Whether
for
that's
some
still
time.
true, you can tell me whether that's true because you're an American, but it doesn't look like it to me, and it doesn't look
No,
like that anywhere
although
else.
I would say it's more true in America. I think America's shot in those terms. And I do have hope for something like that coming back, but I would say it is more true in America than any other major
Well, it's interesting. I
industrialized
think in
country.
America, in many ways, America is more tyrannical because it's bigger and more powerful. But in other ways, you've got a lot of advantages that we Europeans haven't got, like free speech, for example, which
Yeah,
I
that comes in
frankly
handy
I
every
would
now and
be
then.
frankly I'm extremely jealous of, and a lot of other things like a more far more systemic idea of local democracy than we have here. So it's kind of
Yeah,
you're a country that was founded on the idea that you're not supposed to let tyrants lord over you, which is a good
right.
it's
I
a
think
good
it's a good
foundation for a
idea.
nation,
Now
right? So
you've been
talking about
involved with
hierarchy again, just
you've been
coming back to
involved
your
with
question
other
about
groups
hierarchy,
that
right?
are anti-tyrannical. I started reading One No, Many Yeses,
Oh
and
yeah,
it
those
starts
are the
out in
days.
Mexico, and I've always been interested in that movement. I guess that's the Zapatistas was sort of the movement I was.
Yeah, the Zapatistas were very inspiring for me. Still are in many ways.
Yeah, me too. And I'm wondering if you have any hope for, in the most, childlike way, if we could just sort of open. I'd like to take some time to kind of think about really the best possible futures. Is there any hope for building coalitions of these many yeses? I feel like that's a little bit of what the Doomer Optimist Wagon Box project is trying to do, build coalitions from homesteaders and homeschoolers and computer programmers and all these different sort of folks who have some common threads. But what's your best possible scenario? Sort of not your only dream, but what kind of vision do you see of possible coalitions for between these many S's? And maybe you could describe a little bit one no many S's, kind of what that meant in that book.
Yeah, well, that was my first book, and I published that in 2003 when I was young and very excited and very into changing the world through mass movements. And it was interestingly as well, by the way, very much a book of the left, and I was very much a man of the left. And I wouldn't call myself a man of the left anymore. I wouldn't call myself a man of the right either. But I probably got a bit of both going on. I always did have. But that the title of that book comes from a Mexican thinker called Gustavo Esteva, died a few years back, who was trying to describe what the Zapatista movement wanted. And the point was that not just the Zapatista movement, but the general anti globalization movement that was going on at the time, around the turn of the century. And the point he was making was that this movement all said no to the same thing, which was exactly this global concentration of corporate power and state power, the whole globalization project, which swept away people's actual rights within their nations and their communities to determine what happened to them and replaced it with this global market, this global culture. So people were saying no to the same thing, but they weren't all saying yes to the alternative. So it wasn't a new form of
Right.
Stalinism or something where we all have a grand theory and we impose the grand theory and it creates a utopia. Everyone has a different yes because communities are different and nations are different and people are different and cultures are different. So what's right for the Zapatistas in Mexico is not going to be right for you guys in Wyoming, and that's not
Sure.
going to be right for the people in Ireland, and that's not going to be right for people in England, and within these countries, there's a lot of diversity at the local level. So that's the point of the coalition. The Zapatistas used to inspire me because the Zapatistas were the only rebellion in history that was aimed at a free trade treaty. Right? They started their revolution on the day that NAFTA came into power,
NAFTA, right.
1994, came into force, because it was going to destroy the indigenous farming culture there with a flood of free products from America and Canada. But they wanted local democracy, and they decided they were going to try and get it by force of arms, um,
Yeah.
even though they didn't kill anybody. Mainly because they were trying to stand up for something both radical and local and indigenous and international and traditional and revolutionary. All of these things somehow fitted together. And I always found that very inspiring, and I still do. So I think that the only thing that's worth being optimistic about that at kind of a political level, because I don't have any interest in national politics, I think it's all huge fraud, is exactly this kind of thing, is exactly things happening at the local level and rising
Mm-hmm.
from the ground up and actually making things happen. And then, as you say, forging alliances with people who may not have all the same opinions as you and may not come from the same cultures as you and all that, but you have enough in common because you know what the no is, you know what the no of against the machine, against the power structures, and you want to have the freedom at the local level to forge your own culture and to live in your
Mm-hmm.
own way, and that's a profoundly human thing. And it's also a very eternal and very old thing. This kind of struggle of locality against power is about as ancient as the human race. You know, you can trace it back through at least a
Yeah.
thousand years in the country that I come from. It's the thing that's always happened. It's the center versus
That
the
was the thing
people,
that,
if you like.
I mean, when you wrote that book, that was sort of peak liberalism and sort of peak end of history globalization of a sort of vague sense of free market and a blending of cultures and people into this just giant marketplace, this sort of Walmartizing of the world with this sort of global, somewhat hidden police state keeping it all in order. And that seems to be falling apart. I mean, the NAFTA and all that, the whole liberalist project was, for instance, in America, largely, well, it was both parties, Democrat and Republican, but it certainly was a Republican thing. And now, love or hate the new administration, they aren't buying into that. Um, there is a turn in this new administration in America away from this sort of globalist blurring of all lines. And I guess there's been some of that in Europe too with Brexit and all that. I guess what I'm trying to imagine though is like, what's the next step? How could we actually really build these communities? What would that look like? Um, and I wonder, for me, I do come back to you said it's not about technology, and I agree with that. But I do feel that there are some coming, and we've talked about this, some coming decisions that people will have to make. Um, some bright lines of, are you going to be, going to have the app and the this and the that, whatever. And I straddle these worlds. I mean, I had a laptop in 1997, 98. Was day trading during lunch in high school. I mean, I'm hardly my Luddite bona fides are not that great, but I've also
It's going to be
uh,
like,
I mean, I've lived in the woods a lot. I grew up off grid. Used a typewriter for a couple years in college before we had to email papers in. So I straddle this question, and I think you do too. You were just living in I imagine, it's a fairly low tech environment. You spent a week out. Oh, tell us briefly about that. We were Mount Alphos.
yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff there. So look, uh, just thinking as you spoke that if you told all of us young anti-globalization activists 25 years ago that the most significant figure in destroying the globalization project was going to be Donald Trump, the guy from reality TV with the flashy golden towers. But he is.
Yes,
That's what's happened. Like you say, love him or hate him, he's pretty much single-handedly taken that project apart. Although it was ready to be taken apart already, he just happened to somehow
sure.
accidentally step into this space and accidentally harness it. I'm not sure even he knew what he was doing, but ever since 2016, in all sorts of places, that project's been falling apart. I think it was falling apart since 2008, actually, since the crash.
Hmm.
This attempt, very utopian post-war attempt to create this global liberal system, liberal politically, liberal culturally, liberal economically. As you say, the end of history. That was but we were all supposed to converge on sort of liberal American democracy with capitalism, basically, and it didn't
Right.
happen. It wasn't going to work. It looked inevitable for a while, actually, but then it's come crumbling down. So the question now is what comes afterwards, and any number of things could come, and they could be terrible or they could be wonderful. There'll probably be a combination of both. Last time liberalism collapsed, we got communism and then we got fascism. So it's just not it's not
Sure.
inherently a good thing being post-liberal, but we'll see. Um, but yeah, so we are
What's
in
the
this
best
hyper.
possible outcome? I mean, do you have any
Well, the
hope
best.
for Ireland sort of not being just a vassal to Brussels?
Well, that's the question. Ireland is a very small country, and its political elite are still stuck in about 1997. Actually, they're still at peak liberalism, and they think they're going to hold on to it. Ireland doesn't have a great deal of room for manoeuvre because it's very small, and its entire economy is also dependent on American multinationals at this point. But there's a lot of look. The hope is always the same, as far as I'm concerned. The hope is always at the local level, and what we can see is that things can change really fast. Right? I mean,
Hmm.
they're changing really fast at the moment. They've been changing really fast everywhere for 5 years. In the next 5 years, we've got no idea what's going to happen anywhere. The whole system's
Sure.
changing and crumbling away. So, as I say, it could be terrible, but the best case scenario is that there's a real relocalization of power and there's a real holding of power to account by local people. And a lot of the bullshit and the lies and the nonsense that's been building up around us for the last 5 or 10 years just crumbles away. You can see that starting to happen already. There's a sense that people don't believe anything they're told by anyone in power, and that's not necessarily good or healthy, but it's where we are. So, best case
Probably.
scenario, like I say, there's a kind of relocalization and a redemocratization. Worst case scenario is lots of tyrannies arise and walk into the void. So, who knows?
I guess even then, local tyrannies, smaller tyrannies, are better than a creeping global tyranny.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
local anything
back in
is
the
always better.
day,
Just
you could just kill the king.
yeah, totally. Yeah, so anything that anything that is small scale is better than anything that is large scale, just because it's more reachable by human hands. Like you say, if you've got a king of your town, you know who the king is. You can throw him out of the room and you can replace him with another king in the way that you cannot do in a modern nation state. So yeah,
Sure.
the small is always more beautiful. It doesn't make it
Sure.
less. Doesn't make it doesn't mean it's never going to be evil or terrible, but it just means it's more manageable at scale.
Sure. Well, on the small thing and getting back to the technology thing, something that is constantly in the back of my mind is, where is my people? Where is my, you talk about the Zapatistas or this or that, and it's always gets back to a small, tight knit community. And my friends are all over the country, all over the world. I don't feel like I have a local tight knit community. And I think many people don't. And that's not something that happens overnight. But do you think there's any hope for rebuilding small scale, tight knit communities? What would that, I mean, how is that even possible?
Well, the question is whether it's possible and also whether people actually want it, because small scale, tight knit communities have plenty of downsides as well as upsides, right? And like
Sure.
you, I'm a guy who, my family were in much the same part of Britain for a long time, but they're not there anymore, and neither am I. And that's just what modern people are like. We're not the Zapatistas. They're indigenous people who live in Chiapas, and even the Zapatistas are online and an international global movement now. So, this is the way it is. So most of us aren't living in those small scale, tight knit communities. Some of us have a nostalgia for them, but a lot of people don't and would like to flee. I mean, like I live in Ireland, right? A lot of people in Ireland are happy not to be living in the small scale, tight knit communities that existed 50 years ago. Some of them aren't. Some of them have mixed feelings. Um,
Sure.
so here's a great phrase, which I came across in James C. Scott's book. James C. Scott, the great historian, who, if you haven't read him, you should, wrote a
Right.
couple of great books. One is called The Art of Not Being Governed, which is a great book, and the other one is called Seeing Like a State, and they're all about the stuff we've just been talking about.
Hmm.
But anyway, he quotes at one point another historian, who Malcolm Yapp, I think his name was, who came up with this terrific phrase, jellyfish tribes. And he's trying to describe the way that particular tribal people and particular distributed cultures would try and resist the encroachment of the state. So, particularly, he's writing about Southeast Asia and how people in the highlands and the uplands of Southeast Asia would avoid the state trying to come and literally enslave them or tax them or suck them into the system by forming these tribes that were like jellyfish. They would just separate out and go their different ways, and then they would come back together again. So you have these kind of distributed tribes. They're not necessarily all rooted in one place because that makes them easy to capture. They're
Hmm.
distributed, but they're still in contact with each other, right? So it's
Hmm.
almost as if that's a very effective way to move when you're trying to resist power at a local level, but you're not necessarily in a rooted ancient community where you've lived forever and ever. And you're also, for better or for worse, connected by the internet, which brings plenty of horrors with it, but also gives us a chance to talk to each other. Here we are doing it.
Here we are.
So it does allow you to get in touch with people who actually feel the way you do, which you may not have been able to do 50 years ago. So there's an interesting way in which the formation of jellyfish tribes, distributed
Hmm.
people who are fighting for the same thing, which is kind of the sort of people who'll probably end up getting together at the Wagon Box, right? From all over the
Pretty
country and other
much.
parts of the world. All these
Yeah.
jellyfish converge on your inn, and then you have these conversations and they float off again. And that actually makes it very hard to pin those people down because they're all over the place, literally, and they're
Sure.
and they're floating around, but they're getting together and they're connected. So I really like that image of
I
these
think it's a
these kind
beautiful
of
image,
jellyfish coming
and it
together.
it's hopeful for me. I do appreciate, everybody likes to get nostalgic for settlement, being settled, having a community, but many cultures in the past were nomadic. Um, but I can't help but think that eventually somebody's got to stay put somewhere. I mean, the Wendell Berry
Mm.
sort of concept, and I guess it's scary for me trying to imagine that, but I am sometimes hopeful, and I wonder if the coming technological divides will help accelerate that. Where if for those who decide not to go all in on the modern information technology. If you don't want to, have everything on your phone or the chip that's in you or whatever, there's going to be perhaps so much difficulty in transportation and shopping and whatever that it might require people sort of banding together and require institutions. And this is one of my hopes for Wagon Box, institutions that mediate these different groups, right? So you might have a whole off-grid, what you call in the raw cooked spectrum, a raw
Hmm.
group that's able to use, the Wagon Box or other places as a bit of a intermediary where you meet the other people who are totally plugged in and you can kind of connect and get resources, get information, something like that. And that's one of the things I like for this Wagon Box publication is, not everybody's online. But people get email, they're not online all the time or whatever, they can't travel. But being able to connect people using technology and eventually maybe having a written newsletter or something like that.
Yeah,
VHS. We'll
technology's
record podcasts and send them out VHS.
yeah, proper old zines that you just post out to
Zines,
people.
yeah.
That's the way forward. Um, Last time I saw you, you were trying to buy a huge printing press. Do you remember that?
We went and looked
A
at a printing press. It
proper
was
old fashioned, like
as
mechanical
big as
printing
this
press doesn't
room.
even require any electricity. That's the way forward. Because technology is absolutely going to be the divide. So to speak of Wendell Berry, he famously said it could be that in the future the divide is going to be between those who choose to live as machines and those who choose to live as creatures. And that's pretty much where we are. And it is becoming harder and harder and harder to function at any level without digital technology. We all have to use it to some degree, but it's
No.
becoming more and more intense. It's becoming more and more difficult. When the likes of Elon Musk, who now seems to be the main man in America, is get onto the project of chipping everybody's brains and then sending them off to Mars. The, the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, the interconnected digital future, that's all coming very, very, very fast. And AI is going so fast and so frighteningly now that people don't even know where it's going to be in 5 years. So as you say, and I talked about this quite a lot in the book as well. That the big question for everyone now is where you draw your line, and everybody has to make decisions about that. Do
Yeah.
you want a smartphone? If you have a smartphone, how are you going to use it? Do you need a computer? What are you going to use your computer for? How far are you going to go with digital tech? How much stuff are you going to have? How interconnected is your house going to be? Are you going to have an Alexa to close your curtains? Whatever.
No.
What is
What?
going to be the point where you say, thus far and no further, this is the connection I'm going to have? And as you say, some people are going to want to and already have stepped off the machine altogether.
Yeah. And other people might go all in. And what I'm trying to avoid personally is turning it into a moral thing because although there certainly are moral components, I don't think there have to be. I think there could be very good people who go all in. And I think maybe at least the best perspective for me and you is to think about what coalitions would look like. What are the interface between these different groups? How do you get the Jetsons and the Flintstones to get along?
Well,
And I
yeah,
think it's
you see,
possible.
I'm much more skeptical about the tech bros than you are. You know that. So I think there's a difference between. So everybody should definitely get along. I think that's definitely, and I can learn a lot from sitting down and talking to AI developers. Actually, I find it very interesting. I was doing it quite recently. I met a guy who'd spent the last 10 years making robot arms, and wanted to explain to me how wonderful AI was going to be. So it's a good conversation to have.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you get to the point where there's a fundamental difference in worldviews. You know that you have to which isn't to say you can't talk to people or spend time with them, but you have to decide at some point what side you're going to stand on.
Hmm.
I'm not ever going to be on the same side as people who want to put chips in our brains so that we can see each other's thoughts. And I'm not going to be on the
Right.
same
But
side
you
as
got to
people who
be,
want to live
I think the
forever
only
by
hope,
uploading your brain and all the rest of it. So,
yeah, but how can we reach those people if we don't have some kind of a good faith?
yeah, no, like
I
I said, have a
often
good
get in
faith. Have a
trouble
good
with
faith.
our
Talk.
people for going to bat for Elon. I like Elon. Um,
Yeah.
I hate the idea of chipping brains. I don't. I'm sort of. I don't really care one way or another about going to Mars. I think it's exciting, not so much going to Mars, but I think here's a guy. who realizes that people need a big vision. And I think the big vision that we need to have is union with God. Um, you know, uh,
Hmm. I
but
agree.
I think going to Mars is better than, the end of history vision of, hey, you can, go to Walmart and eat all the chocolates you want and sit at home and watch TV all day. That's a terrible vision. It was basically sort of the vision we had in the late 90s, early 2000s. Hey, it's gonna be great.
Well,
We can all eat all we want, watch all the play all
yeah.
the
I
video
mean, look,
games we want. So I think
I think
Elon's caught on this idea that we need a big vision, and I still hold out hope that guys like him are in flux. They're figuring things out. We got to get Elon to the Wagon Box and get him in the stream. Get both of you in the stream, and a couple cold plunges and some conversations. And I think maybe we can help chart a
we
better
can
path
figure it
forward.
all out. We'll figure it all out.
We'll figure it all
We'll
out.
reach the middle ground. It'll all be fine. I would actually genuinely like to have a conversation with Elon Musk just because I want to figure the guy out. Um, but I find him a very disturbing character, actually. But I tell
Hmm.
you what, you are right about. I think that the thing about a vision and an adventure and a project is true, whatever your project is. Much as I find a lot of his projects terrifying and insane, although he's by no means the worst of the tech bros. Actually, there are people far worse than him. So I agree with you, but I do not. I'm very disturbed by where it's going. But you're right, and the attraction for people like that, especially for men, actually, especially for young men, is
Sure.
they give you a project, give you an adventure. They say, right, this is what we're going to do now.
That's it.
So, and that urge is always going to be there. And you're right, it's better than sitting on the sofa eating chocolate, right? So the question is always, where do you direct the urge? And that's probably, again, something we're going to battle forever. A culture like this, a machine culture, is always going to want to go to Mars. It's always going to want to colonize the universe. That's the next step. It's always going to want this planet's never going to be good enough. Jeff Bezos was talking about this recently, and he was on about how we need to colonize the entire universe and fill it with millions of humans, and then we'll have thousands of Mozarts, and everything will be better. And it's all this kind of slightly autistic vision of society, which I find a bit disturbing. But I understand it as well, especially for young guys. I've got a teenage son. He doesn't just want to sit on his bum all his life. He wants to go out and have adventures. So
Sure.
the question is, what kind of adventure you're having? So
Yeah.
that's the conversation that needs to be had. But you are right that bringing people together from really different backgrounds and getting them to talk to each other is a really good idea. If nothing else, you get to see how widely apart your visions are and what common ground you might have and what you agree with and what you don't. You might find you have all sorts of things in common you would never have suspected. So that is
Yeah.
that is well worth doing,
And
especially at the moment when everything is so massively politically divided and black and white. It's a
well, we
good
have to
idea.
each look at ourselves and think, my goodness, who would have thought 20 years ago that this is where I'd be now? Uh,
Yeah, that's
and
true.
so people change. People are changing. Their thinking is in flux, and you look at the huge changes that have gone down in America in the last month. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, Snoop
Well,
Dogg playing at the inauguration.
it happens slowly and then very fast, doesn't it? Change.
Yeah,
That's what happens. It
but I
builds
mean, I
up and
think
then
it's
suddenly bang.
possible somebody like Elon could look at the Neuralink thing or whatever, and maybe it has to get worse before it gets better. But maybe there's a point that they say this wasn't good. This was a bad idea.
Mm,
We
yeah.
gotta blow up the
That's
bridge.
why it's why the communication matters. And I'm endlessly asking myself why I bother to write anything down. I have a very conflicted relationship with writing. Sometimes I just wake up and I want to just never write anything again and have a peaceful life. And I might do that if I had any money, but I have to earn a living. But that's not the only reason I write. If
Sure,
Elon phoned me up and gave me 10 million quid, then maybe I'd stop writing, but probably not. That would be a good story for a start. But there's something
see what I
about the
can do.
need to communicate. The writers have this unhealthy need to communicate, but there's also the fact that only by trying to write these things out do you get firstly to understand what you actually believe about them, and but then also to try and explain them to other people, and then you find that you have all sorts of people reading you never expected, many of whom will be on completely the opposite side of the argument to you, but they want to
Sure.
know what you got to say, and I want to know what they've got to say. I want to read what these people think about the world. It's the only way that we can actually work out what the hell is going on and what might be changing and what we think and what is actually true.
Hmm.
So it's all communication in the end. That's whether it's sitting around talking in a place or writing it down or sticking things on the internet, films or whatever. The only way that we're going to probably avoid killing each other, but also get to an interesting and useful future is just by keeping having those conversations. You have to do that, especially with the people who don't agree with you, because they're always the most interesting ones.
I believe that. And I think for all the craziness going on in the world, I think a lot of people are coming to that realization. I hope they do in America. I mean, in Europe, but in America, the ability to have good faith conversations, um, it's fundamental to having to all these other things. Because if you can't talk about these things, if you can't share ideas without being threatened to be deplatformed or locked up, then everything else kind of goes by the wayside. Um, well, I look forward to getting you out to the Mountain West. You'll be at the Wagon Box end of June, and people can sign up for that event. It's going to be, I think it's going to be great. I'd like to get some good conversations between the likes of you and some of our other more machine skeptic folks, and maybe we can get somebody like Elon or Peter Thiel or one of the tech bros out
You're going to
there.
get Elon down to bathe in the river.
Yeah, we'll get Elon in the creek.
If you get
Um,
Elon Musk down to bathe in your stream, you're going to sell out in 5 minutes. People are just going to want to watch that. It's going to want to see him
It's going
jumping
to be
in.
great. It's going to be huge. It's going to be amazing. And your book is coming out in October, Against the Machine.
Yeah, September, I think, end of September
Oh,
it turns out.
September. Ends of
Yeah.
September. Great. So, yeah, lots of good things going on. I'm hopeful. I think I'm going to eventually set up my little Ewok community in the woods. And, we'll have one line of communication out, so we'll still be able to get word out. And I think institutions like the Wagon Box and other, I think, can sort of be, yeah, bridges where these different folks can meet and discuss and let the ideas play out. But it's got to be in good faith. And I appreciate you being able to talk to folks in good faith that you disagree with. And I think there's hope yet. I think the machine's coming down.
That's a good
Be
note
there
to
to
end on.
celebrate. Cool. Well, you have a good evening there in Ireland, and we'll see you this summer.
Yeah, take care. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for coming on the show. Take care.
Cheers.